Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time to get back to the drawing board. I want to start tonight by reading you a little pitch. When you lose a war, there's nothing to do but pick up the pieces, strike out on your own, make a name to remember, maybe a little something to live on. Frank Dugan saw the Southern Isles. His name's a legend on the island citadel. But that wasn't enough for him. The Ash's defeat still smoldered. He had a price to pay. For me, no place was as unknown as Hexwood, no name as forgettable as Mark. But Hexwood is my town, and Mark is my name. If Dugan wants his price from here, he better start building the funeral pyre. One of us will need it before we're through. So that's the pitch for the project I'm working on right now, which I call Hexwood. And I really think that I want to do a few videos on the creative process, specifically my creative process, and how I interpret it, how it helps me work. And I wanted to start with the pitch, because I think pitches are pretty important. Pitches aren't really the first thing I think you do when you develop an idea. But I think they're important because you need to find the essentials of your story for a pitch. You need to find the most important ideas. You need to distill them. You need to put them in a few essential sentences. And once you have these sentences, you can very easily communicate the idea of the project to someone else. And it really helps you refine in your own mind what the point of your story is. And that way, as you begin to work on it and develop it, you emphasize those parts more in your mind, and you don't, it helps keep you on track. A lot of creators, myself included, have a tendency to chase bunny trails. We want to go after every idea that pops up. And that's great from a creative standpoint, but it doesn't make for good storytelling. Stories really need to be very focused. You can't have too many loose threads or your whole story unravels. So, what all do we have in this pitch? You're not really going to be able to read it, I'm afraid. But first things first. The first thing is mentioned in the pitch is losing a war. That's a big part of the world of Hexwood. It's based on the Old West. And in the Old West, a big aspect was the fact that it happened, the Old West basically dates from the time of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century. Recovering from that conflict was something that almost everyone in the Old West was doing. So I wanted that to be a theme in the world of Hexwood, because while it's not the Old West as it occurred, as we know it in America, it is a weird Western setting, and I wanted it to have a lot of the same feels of the classic Westerns. So the first thing I did was I included a large conflict in the history of the world. The second thing I did is I talked a little bit about the things the characters are going to try and be doing. Making a name to remember, making a little something to live on. And because they're out in the West, there's going to be a lot of being out on their own. So all three of those things are packed into the next two sentences. These are the themes of Hexwood. Next, we introduce two characters. One of them is Frank. He's the villain. He has already a significant reputation. And he's traveled a lot of places. He's seen a lot of things. He's already very famous in some place called the Island Citadel. Where that is really isn't important to the pitch or really to the story. But he's a legend in a place, and that sounds impressive. So right away, I want that out there. But he's got a chip on his shoulder. He has a price to pay. On the other hand, Mark is, maybe he's not as big a deal. He's in a pretty forgettable place. No one's ever heard of Hexwood. He's got a very ho-hum life. His name's easily forgotten. But, this unimportant place with an unimportant guy in it, they're important to Mark. And if Frank's grudge comes into play against Hexwood, well then, there's going to be trouble. And that's essentially the heart of the story. It's not a big story. It's not a very complex story, but it deals with, essentials. Mark and Frank went through the same thing. They were both on the losing side of the war, but they reacted to it very differently. And the difference of their reaction is going to put them in conflict. That's the central conflict of the story, and it's right there in the pitch. So having a pitch like this, I think, before you start outlining, before you start, designing scenarios or major storylines, you want to have a pitch that sums up the theme of your story. And that will help you when you outline and when you design your scenarios to really dial in on those aspects of the story. Again, not saying you can't have other aspects of the story. I mean, I only named 2 of the 4 main characters in here, to say nothing of the side characters. So this is just the heart of the story. And, a heart is great, but it doesn't do you a whole lot without the rest of the body to go along with it. So, your outline, your pitch, is not just what you share with other people, but it should be the essentials that are in your mind about what this story is. And don't trick yourself into thinking that you can just say, well, I know in my head what the essentials are, and I can just pitch it whenever. People think they know what's in their head a lot more than they generally actually do. If you ask people to explain things that they're thinking about to you, they will often struggle. That's true of me. That's true of most of the other smart people I've known. The exception is, of course, if they've taken the time to work those ideas out ahead of time. And one of the best ways to do that is to write it down, to revise it, and to edit it. So what I do when I write a pitch like this is I just start by writing out a paragraph of all the major ideas here. And then I kind of like move them around to make it flow better. I cross out redundant parts, words you don't need. I rephrase things, and then I write it out again. And maybe you don't do as much editing, and hopefully by the 3rd or the 4th time, you have a pretty solid grasp on the pitch. And the big thing here is you want to be very concise. Use as few words as possible. I cut, as you can see, I cut much more than I add in, although I do add in as well. And sometimes the stuff that I am adding in is just a shorter or more concise version of what I've crossed out. You also want to consider the order you tell things in. In this first draft, I actually I talked about Mark first and Frank second, but I found that having Frank first allows me to put more emphasis on Mark's situation, because that's where we end up with. We talk about Mark being in Hexwood and feeling unimportant. And then we talk about Frank and all the ways that he's made a big, impressive name for himself that makes him feel dangerous and threatening. When I come back to, the trouble in Hexwood, it's harder to remember Mark. And Mark is supposed to be, the vantage point character in the story. So that's why I switched the order in the 2nd and 3rd drafts. So yeah, I used to think pitches were not important, or at least not important from an early stage. I thought it was a thing that you did at the end. But when I started outlining my stories very seriously, and we'll talk about outlining more in another video, but when I started outlining my stories really seriously, what I found was that if I outlined and then I tried to write a pitch, there were all these little side ideas and sub themes and whatnot that worked their way into the outline that were really hard to put into the pitch. Whereas if I wrote a pitch first, and I really got drilled down to what I wanted the story to be. And then I outlined. I got an outline that was smoother, that was more focused, that was stronger, more like the trunk of a tree. Is a very good way to think of your outline. And then you can branch out into sub-themes and the like on a second draft, if you really want them there. Or you can always ask yourself, do I really need this sub-theme? Should this be its own story? Questions like that. And I've just found that maintaining that focus, once I have the pitch worked out, is easier for me. And I would recommend it for other writers as well, just so you have that really clear idea. What is my story about? Where does it want to go? That way, you can start your story where the rubber meets the road. There are a lot of stories that don't start at the most interesting point, and they take their time working there. And I really think that's because when the author started writing their story, they didn't really have a solidified idea of what the heart of their story was. And they were so caught up in the sub-themes and the other cool ideas they had, they got a little sidetracked. But I have found that writing a pitch first helps keep you more focused. So that's where I'd start. Plus, as you write an outline and as you start to write a script or the body of your novel or whatever it is you're working on, you're going to want to share it with other people to get feedback, because that's a very important part of the creative process. And of course, when you share something with someone, they're going to ask you what it's about. And if you have that pitch all ready to go, before you even show them an outline for feedback on, well, then you're just that much better off. You can clearly communicate the story you want to tell. So, yeah, that's just to start off talking about the creative process, a little look at pitches. I hope you enjoyed that. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. Use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.